Okay, had some problems, but now I think I got them resolved. Waiting for YouTube to catch up. Excellent. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to go ahead and be looking through the Wikipedia article on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Going to pick it back up where we were a moment ago. Got the window open. Hopefully the ambient sounds of the city aren't going to bother us too much, but it is very hot, so I'm glad to have it open for right now. Let's go ahead and hop in real quick. Quick water break. All right. During the Gulf War in 1990 to 1991, Arafat supported Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait and opposed the U.S.-led coalition attack on Iraq. After the Gulf War, Kuwait authorities forcibly pressured nearly 200,000 Palestinians to leave Kuwait. The policy, which partly led to this exodus, was responsible for the alignment of PLO leader Yasser Arafat with Saddam Hussein. Arafat's decision also severed relations with Egypt and many of the oil-producing Arab states that supported the U.S.-led coalition. Many in the U.S. also used Arafat's position as a reason to disregard his claims to being a partner for peace. After the end of hostilities, many Arab states that backed the coalition cut funds off to the PLO, which brought the PLO to the brink of crisis. In the aftermath of the 1991 Gulf War, the coalition's victory in the Gulf War opened a new opportunity to advance the peace process. The U.S. launched a diplomatic initiative in cooperation with Russia, which resulted in the October 1991 Madrid Peace Conference. The conference was hosted by the government of Spain and co-sponsored by the U.S. and the USSR. The Madrid Peace Conference was an early attempt by the international community to start a peace process through negotiations involving Israel and the Palestinians, as well as Arab countries including Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. The Palestinian team, due to Israeli objections, was initially formally a part of a joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation and consisted of Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza without open PLO associations. In January 1993, Israeli and Palestine Liberation Organization negotiators began secret negotiations in Oslo, Norway. On September 9, 1993, Yasser Arafat sent a letter to Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, stating that the PLO officially recognized Israel's right to exist and officially renouncing terrorism. On September 13th, Arafat and Rabin signed a declaration of principles in Washington, D.C. on the basis of the negotiations between Israeli and Palestinian teams in Oslo and Norway. The declaration was a major conceptual breakthrough achieved outside of the Madrid framework, which specifically barred foreign residing PLO leaders from the negotiating process. After this, a long process of negotiation known as the Oslo Peace Process began. During the Oslo Peace Process throughout the 1990s, as both sides obligated to work towards a two-state solution, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization negotiated unsuccessfully and tried to reach a mutual agreement. One of the main features of the Oslo peace process was the establishment of the Autonomous Government Authority, the Palestinian Authority, and its associated governing institutions to administer Palestinian communities in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. During the Oslo peace process throughout the 1990s, the Palestinian Authority was ceded authority from Israel over various regions of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This process gave it governmental and economic authority over many Palestinian communities. It also gave the Palestinian Authority many of the components of a modern government and society, including a Palestinian police force, legislature, and other institutions. In return for these concessions, the Palestinian Authority was asked to promote tolerance for Israel within Palestinian society and acceptance of Israel's right to exist. One of the most contentious issues surrounding this peace process is whether the Palestinian Authority in fact met its obligations to promote tolerance. There is specific evidence that the Palestinian Authority actively funded and supported many terrorist activities and groups. The Palestinians stated that any terrorist acts stemmed from Israel not having conceded enough land and political power to win support among ordinary Palestinians. Palestinians stated that any terrorist acts stem from Israel not having conceded enough land and political power to win support among ordinary Palestinians. Israelis stated that these acts of terrorism were because the Palestinian Authority openly encouraged and supported incitement against Israel and terrorism. There was increasing disagreement and debate among Israelis about the amount of positive results and benefits produced by the Oslo process. Supporters said it produced advances leading to a viable Palestinian society. it was producing advances leading to a viable Palestinian society which would promote genuine acceptance of Israel. Opponents say that the concessions were merely emboldening extremist elements to commit more violence in order to win further concessions, without providing any real acceptance, benefits, goodwill, or reconciliation for Israel in return. In February 1994, Baruch Goldstein, a member of the Koch Party, murdered 29 Palestinians and wounded 125 at the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, which became known as the Cave of the Patriarchs Massacre. As an act of revenge to the massacre, in April 1994, Hamas launched suicide attacks targeting the Israeli civilian population in many locations throughout Israel. However, once the Hamas started to use these means, it became a regular pattern of action against Israel. On September 28, 1995, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat signed the Israeli-Palestinian Interim Agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in Washington. The agreement marked the conclusion of the first stage of negotiations between Israel and the PLO. The agreement allowed the PLO leadership to relocate to the occupied territories and granted autonomy to the Palestinians, with talks to follow regarding final status. In return, the Palestinians recognized Israel's right to exist and promised it to abstain from use of terror. I'm just checking on OBS, checking on YouTube. Very good. However, the agreement was opposed by the Hamas and other Palestinian factions, whom at this point were already committing suicide bomber attacks throughout Israel. Tensions in Israel, arising from the continuation of terrorism and anger at loss of territory, led to the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin by a right-wing Jewish radical on November 4, 1995. Upon Rabin's assassination, the Israeli Prime Minister post was filled by Shimon Peres. Peres continued Rabin's policies in supporting the peace process. In 1996, increasing Israeli doubts about the peace process led to Benjamin Netanyahu of the Likud party winning the election, mainly due to his promise to use a more rigid line in negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. Netanyahu raised many questions about many central promises of the Oslo process. One of his main points of disagreement with the Oslo premise that the negotiations should proceed in stages, meaning that concessions should be made to Palestinians before any resolution was reached on major issues such as the status of Jerusalem and the amending of the Palestinian National Charter. Oslo supporters had claimed the multi-stage approach would build goodwill among Palestinians and would propel them to seek reconciliation when these major issues were raised in later stages. Netanyahu said that these concessions only gave encouragement to extremist elements without receiving any tangible gestures in return. He called for tangible gestures of Palestinian goodwill in return for Israeli concessions. In January 1996, Israel assassinated the chief bomb maker of Hamas, Yahya Ayash, I think is how that's going to be pronounced. In reaction to this, Hamas carried out a wave of suicide attacks in Israel. Following these attacks, the Palestinian Authority began to act against the Hamas and oppress their activity. In January 1997, Netanyahu signed the Hebron Protocol with the Palestinian Authority, resulting in the redeployment of Israeli forces in Hebron and the turnover of civilian authority in much of the, I don't know if that's Hebron or Hebron, and the turnover of civilian authority in much of the area to the Palestinian Authority. In 1997, after two deadly suicide attacks in Jerusalem by Hamas, Israeli secret agents were sent to Jordan to eliminate the political head of the Department of Hamas, Khalid Marshall, using a special poison. The operation failed and the secret agents were captured. In return for their release, Israel sent over the medicine which saved his life and freed a dozen Palestinian prisoners, including Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. This release and the increase of the security force of the Palestinian Authority led to a ceasefire in the suicide attacks and to the outbreak of the Second Intifada. Eventually, the lack of progress of the peace process led to new negotiations, which produced the Wye River Memorandum, which detailed the steps to be taken by the Israeli government and Palestinian Authority to implement the earlier interim agreement of 1995. It was signed by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat, and on November 17, 1998, Israel's 120-member parliament, I'm going to guess just Knesset, approved by the Wye River Memorandum by a vote of 75 to 19. In 1999, Ehud Barak was elected to Prime Minister. Barak continued Rabin's policies in supporting the peace process. In 2000, 18 years after Israel occupied southern Lebanon in the 1982 Lebanon War, the occupation ended as Israel unilaterally withdrew its remaining forces from the security zone in southern Lebanon.
As the violence increased with little hope for diplomacy, in July 2000, the Camp David 2000 summit, which aimed at reaching a final status agreement. The summit collapsed after Yasser Arafat would not accept a proposal drafted by Americans and Israeli negotiators. Barak was prepared to offer the entire Gaza Strip, a Palestinian capital, and part of East Jerusalem, 73% of the West Bank, excluding Eastern Jerusalem, raising to 90 to 94% of 10 to 25 years, and financial reparations for Palestinian refugees for peace. Arafat turned down the offer without making a counteroffer. Water break. Okay. I want to read more up about this, the Yasser Arafat turning that down. I mean, it could just be that Arafat was just, again, I'm not super familiar with Yasser Arafat or his policies, so I don't want to comment on it. It's strange to me that he turned it down without making even a counteroffer. I want to know a little bit more. I wish I knew a little bit more about what his thought process was there. Something to look into. More stuff. The Second Intifada. After the signing of the Oslo Accords failed to bring about a Palestinian state, in September 2000, the Second Intifada uprising broke out, a period of intensified Palestinian and Israeli violence, which has been taking place until the present day. The Second Intifada has caused thousands of victims on both sides, both among combatants and among civilians, and has been more deadly than the First Intifada. Many Palestinians, although it says who, consider the Second Intifada to be a legitimate war of national liberation against foreign occupation, whereas many Israelis consider it to be a terrorist campaign. The failure of the peace process and the eruption of the Second Intifada, which included increased Palestinian terror attacks being made against Israeli citizens, led much of the Israeli public and political leadership to lose confidence in the Palestinian Authority as a peace partner. Due to an increase in terror attacks during the Second Intifada, mainly carried out by Hamas against Israeli agents, Israeli troops began conducting regular raids and arrests inside the West Bank. In addition, Israel increased the selective assassinations against Hamas operatives. Initially, this policy was aimed at active militants, but later on it was also aimed at the Hamas leadership as well, including Sheikh Ahmad Yassin. This policy spurred controversy within Israel and worldwide. After the collapse of Barak's government, Ariel Sharon was elected prime minister on February 6, 2001. Sharon invited the Israel Labor Party into the coalition to shore up support for the Disengagement Plan. Due to the deterioration of the political situation, he refused to continue negotiations with the Palestinian Authority at the top of summit or under any aspect of the Oslo Accords. At the Beirut summer in 2000, the Arab League proposed an alternative political plan aimed at ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Later on, the proposal was formulated as a political plan widely accepted by all Arab states as well as the Arab League. As part of this plan, all Arab states would normalize the relations with Israel and bring to an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. In addition, the plan required Israel to allow the establishment of an independent Palestinian state and what the plan describes as a just solution for the Palestinian refugees in accordance with the UN National Assembly Resolution 194. Israel rejected the wording of the initiative, but official spokesperson expressed gladness about an Arab initiative for peace and Israel's normalization of the region, although there is a missing citation there. Following a period of relative restraint on the part of Israel after a lethal suicide attack at the Park Hotel in Netanyahu, which happened on March 27, 2000, in which 30 Jews were murdered, Sharon ordered Operation Defensive Shield, a large-scale military operation carried out by the Israeli Defense Forces between March 29 until March 10, 2002, in Palestinian cities in the West Bank. The operation contributed significantly to the reduction of Palestinian terror attacks in Israel. As part of the efforts to fight Palestinian terrorism, in June 2002, Israel began construction of the West Bank barrier. After the barrier went up, Palestinian suicide bombings and other attacks across Israel dropped by 90%. However, this barrier became a major issue of contention between the two sides, as 85% of the walls within territory that is Palestinian, according to the 1948 Green Line. Following the severe economic and security situation in Israel, the Likud party, headed by Ariel Sharon, won the Israeli elections in January 2003 in an overwhelming victory. The elections led to a temporary truce between Israel and the Palestinians, and to the Akuba,
summit in May 2003, in which Sharon endorsed the roadmap for peace put forth by the United States, European Union, and Russia, which opened the dialogue with Mahmoud Abbas, and announced his commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state in the future. Following the endorsing of the roadmap, the Quartet of the Middle East was established, consisting of representatives from the United States, Russia, EU, and UN as an intermediary body of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On March 19, 2003, Arafat appointed Mahmoud Abbas as the prime minister. The rest of Abbas's term as prime minister continued to be characterized by numerous conflicts between him and Arafat over the distribution of power between the two. The United States and Israel accused Arafat of constantly undermining Abbas and his government. Continuing violence and Israeli target killings of known terrorists, citation needed, forced Abbas to pledge a crackdown in order to uphold the Palestinian Authority's side of the road map for peace. This led to a power struggle with Arafat over control of the Palestinian security forces. Arafat refused to release control to Abbas, thus preventing him from using them in a crackdown on militants. Abbas resigned from the post of prime minister in October 2003, citing lack of support from Israel and the United States, as well as internal incitement against his government. In the end of 2003, Sharon embarked on a course of unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip while maintaining control of its coastline and airspace. Sharon's plan has been welcomed by both the Palestinian Authority and Israel's left wing as a step towards a final peace settlement. However, it has been greeted with opposition from within his own Likud party and from other right-wing Israelis, although it says who, on national security, military, and religious grounds. In January 2005, Sharon formed a national unity government that included representatives of Likud, Labor, and Meimad, and Degel HaTorah as out-of-government supporters without any seats in the government. United Torah Judaism parties usually reject having ministerial offices as a policy. Between August 16th and 30, 2005, Sharon controversially expelled 9,480 Jewish settlers from 21 settlements in Gaza and 4 settlements in the northern West Bank. The Disengagement Plan was implemented in September 2005. Following the withdrawal, the Israeli town of I'm just going to guess Derat, and other Israeli and other Israeli communities near the Gaza Strip became subject to constant shelling and mortar bomb attacks from Gaza, with only minimal clarification needed. Israeli response. Water break. Okay, 2005 to present. Following the November 2004 death of longtime Fatah Party PLO leader, Palestinian Authority Chairman Yasser Arafat, Fatah member Mahmoud Abbas was elected president of the Palestinian Authority in January 2005. One key allegation which emerged against the Palestinian Authority after Arafat's death was that over the years Arafat and Fatah officials had received billions of dollars in aid from foreign nations and organizations and had never used this money to develop Palestinian society. It was alleged that the money was used for Arafat's personal expenses. These allegations gradually grew in prominence, which increased Palestinian popular support for the group Hamas, Palestinian society as being more efficient and honest, primarily because it had built various institutions and social services. Hamas also stated clearly that it did not recognize Israel's right to exist and does not recognize the Oslo peace process nor any other peace process with Israel. In addition, Hamas has openly stated through the years that it has encouraged and organized acts of terrorism against Israelis over the years. The Palestinians, the gradual disintegration of the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah organization, and the Israeli Disengagement Plan, and especially the death of Yasser Arafat, led to the policy change of the Hamas movement in early 2005, which started putting greater emphasis on the political characteristics of an organization. In November 2007, the Annapolis Conference was held. The conference marked the first time a two-state solution was articulated as the mutually agreed-upon outline for addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The conference ended with an issue of a joint statement from all parties. Gaza-Israeli conflict. In 2006 Palestinian legislative elections, Hamas won a majority of the Palestinian Legislative Council, prompting the United States and many European countries to cut off all funds to the Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, insisting that the Hamas must recognize Israel, renounce violence, and accept previous peace pacts. Israel refused to negotiate with Hamas, since Hamas never renounced its belief that Israel has no right to exist, and that the entire state of Israel is an illegal occupation which must be wiped out.
EU countries and the United States threatened an economic boycott of Hamas, will not recognize Israel's existence, not renounce terrorism, and shall support the peace agreements signed between the PLO and Israel in the past. Hamas officials have openly stated the organization does not recognize Israel's right to exist, even though the organization expressed openness to hold a long-term truce. Hamas is considered by Israel and 12 other countries to be a terrorist organization and therefore not entitled to participate in formal peace negotiations. In June 2006, during a well-planned operation, Hamas managed to cross the border from Gaza, attack an Israeli tank, kill 2 IDF soldiers, and kidnap wounded Israeli soldiers Gilad Shalit back into the Gaza Strip. In response to numerous rocket firings by Hamas from the Gaza Strip into southern Israel, fighting broke out between Hamas and Israel in the Gaza Strip. In the summer of 2007, a Fatah-Hamas conflict broke out, which eventually led Hamas taking control of the Gaza Strip, which in practice divided the Palestinian Authority into 2. Various authorities affiliated with Fatah engaged in combat with Hamas in numerous gun battles. Most Fatah leaders escaped to Egypt and the West Bank, while some were captured and killed. Fatah remained in control of the West Bank, and President Abbas formed a new governing coalition, which some critics of Fatah said subverts the Palestinian constitution and excludes the majority government of Hamas. A fragile 6-month truce between Hamas and Israel expired on December 9, 2008. Hamas and Israel could not agree on conditions to extend the truce. Hamas blamed Israel for not lifting the Gaza Strip blockade and for an Israeli raid on a purported tunnel crossing the border into the Gaza Strip from Israel on November 4th, which it held constituted a serious breach of the truce. Israel accused Hamas of violating the truce agreement, citing the frequent rocket attacks and mortar attacks on Israeli cities. The Israeli operation began with an intense bombardment of the Gaza Strip, targeting Hamas bases, police training camps, police headquarters, and offices. Civilian infrastructures, including mosques, houses, medical facilities, and schools, were also attacked. Israel said many of these buildings were used by combatants and as storage spaces for weapons and rockets. Hamas intensified its rocket and mortar attacks against targets in Israel throughout the conflict, hitting previously untargeted cities such as Beersheba and Ashdod. On January 3, 2009, the Israeli ground invasion began. The operation resulted in the deaths of more than 1,300 Palestinians, although we need a citation. The IDF released a report stating the vast majority of the dead were Hamas militants. I'm curious what percentage vast majority means there. The Palestinian Center for Human Rights reported that 926 of the 1,417 dead had been civilians and non-combatants. On November 14, 2012, Israel began Operation Pillar of Defense in the Gaza Strip, with the stated aims beginning to halt the indiscriminate rocket attacks originating from the Gaza Strip and to disrupt the capabilities of militant organizations. The operation began with the targeted killing of Ahmad Jabari, chief of Hamas military wing. The IDF stated it targeted more than 1,500 military sites in Gaza Strip, including rocket launching pads, smuggling tunnels, command centers, weapon manufacturing, and storage buildings. According to Palestinian sources, civilian houses were hit, and Gaza health officials state that 167 Palestinians had been killed in the conflict by November 23rd. The Palestinian militant groups fired over 1,456 Iranian Fajr 5 Russian Grad rockets, Qassam, and mortars into Rishon LeZion, Beersheba, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and other population centers. Tel Aviv was hit for the first time since the 1991 Gulf War, and rockets were aimed at Jerusalem. The rockets killed 4 Israeli civilians, 3 of them in a direct hit on a home in Kiryat Malaki, and 2 Israeli soldiers and a number of Palestinian civilians. By November 19th, over 252 Israelis were physically injured in rocket attacks. Israel's Iron Dome defense system intercepted about 421 rockets. Another 142 rockets fell in Gaza itself. 875 rockets fell in open areas, and 58 rockets hit urban areas in Israel. A bomb attack against Tel Aviv bus that wounded over 20 civilians received the blessing of Hamas. On November 21st, a ceasefire was announced after days of negotiation between Hamas and Israel, mediated by Egypt. In October 2011, a deal was reached between Israel and Hamas by which the captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, which would be released in exchange for 1,027 Palestinians and Arab Israeli prisoners, 280 of whom have been sentenced to life in prison for planning and perpetrating various terror attacks against Israeli targets. The military Hamas leader Ahmad Jabari was quoted later as confirming that the prisoner released as part of the deal were collectively responsible for the killing of 569 Israeli civilians. In 2014, another war between Israel and Gaza occurred, resulting in 70 Israeli casualties and over 2,000 Palestinian casualties. Okay, I think I'm going to call it there for right now. Like I said, a lot of this is pretty dense, so I think taking it a bit at a time. Thank you for reading along with me today. If you did, I hope you enjoyed, or I hope you at least learned something. If you wouldn't mind giving the video a like and giving the channel a subscription, that would be very helpful to me. I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much once again, and have a good night.